Ladies and gentlemen, just one more superb intervention in this exciting Freedom Day, and it's hard to imagine a better one. David Rubenstein is known to many of you as America's patriotic philanthropist. He has supported the restoration of the Washington Monument in Monticello. Just yesterday, the papers reported that he's helping the National Park Service restore a house where women's suffrage advocates gathered, and that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And he's really pioneered a vision of philanthropy that has enriched our country and brought history to life. But here at the National Constitution Center, we know David and value him both as a member of our Board of Trustees and as a teacher, because he has lent us a series of beautiful historic documents and then come to the Constitution Center to talk about them and to teach all Americans about them. So he lent us a stone Declaration of Independence. You can see it in the Bill of Rights gallery along with one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights. He came to the Constitution Center to talk about, and the conversation was so good, it was a Freedom Day conversation, a conversation just like the one we're having, that we transcribed the conversation, and then he and I wrote it up together, and it became the introduction to this completely riveting pamphlet on the relationship between the three documents. That's now the introduction to our pocket Constitution, and which you can find online as part of the interactive Constitution. He lent us a 13th Amendment and then came to talk about what that means. He's part of the second founding initiative where we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of all the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. There's no 14th Amendment to loan us because they're really hard to come by, but his homework assignment is going to be to talk about the meaning of the 14th. And his homework for today, which he has diligently fulfilled, is to explore the relationship between the First Amendment, the founding documents, and freedom. How did the founders conceive of the First Amendment? Is it significant that it comes first? And what can their vision tell us about freedom today? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the great patriotic philanthropist, David Rubenstein.
As all of you have learned, nobody can live up to Jeff's introduction, so lower your expectations about my knowledge and what you're going to learn. So what I wanted to do, just in the minutes we have available, is just to talk about something that people don't really focus on that much. We talked today about the First Amendment and how important it is, and it is obviously very important to our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, but I would like to talk a little bit about how unlikely it was that we actually had a First Amendment, how we almost never had one, and where the original documents are today that actually embody this First Amendment. So let me step back a moment and explain it this way. Interestingly, when our country was started, we thought that we had the rights of Englishmen, or English women, but really English men. Because the Magna Carta from 1215 through the various versions through 1215, 1297 had certain rights, but interestingly, the right of free speech was not one of them. That wasn't something that there was a concern by the noblemen that the king was taking away, that they were more concerned about economic and other kinds of issues. They certainly weren't concerned about free speech. That wasn't one of their issues. When the charters for our states were set up, many of them said that you in effect have the rights of Englishmen, which meant to many people the rights of the Magna Carta, but free speech really wasn't one of them. And so ultimately, as you know, when we found that the British were taxing us in ways that we didn't think were appropriate or imposing other constraints, ultimately Congress decided to break away. And ultimately, the Declaration of Independence was drafted as an explanation for that. And the most famous sentence in the English language is in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But there's no mention of free speech, because that wasn't something that Jefferson was as worried about. And in those days, the colonies were more worried about the British imposing other kind of constraints on them, not really taking away free speech. But obviously, everyone was interested in free speech, but it wasn't the driving concern. So what happened was, after we won the war, we actually were operating under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gave every state an equal right, and as a result, not much got done because many states didn't want imposed taxation, many states didn't want to have military, and so it was a very weak government, very weak, so weak that ultimately a number of individuals, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, others, caballed to see if we could get around the Articles of Confederation, and ultimately they had the Congress under the Articles of Confederation in effect issue its own death warrant by saying, let's have a convention, a constitutional convention in Philadelphia where we could figure out how we might amend the Articles of Confederation. But when that convention was held in Philadelphia in 1787, there was very little interest in actually amending the Articles of Confederation. And from the beginning, Madison and Hamilton and others really tried to put together a new government, and they spent several months doing so from May to September. And as we all know, in September, they finally reached agreement. But interestingly, in the times that they were here, May, June, July, and August, no air conditioning, it was very humid. I know people who live in Philadelphia realize that sometimes it's humid. Can you imagine living here with no air conditioning? And also, they agreed when they were doing the Constitutional Convention, everything had to be kept completely silent. And nobody can know on the outside what they're doing, so all the windows had to be closed all the time. One of the problems with that is when the flies got in, they had no way to get out. So they were sitting there with flies biting them from time to time, no air conditioning. It wasn't that pleasant. It's hard to believe we had such a good Constitution came out of it, result of that setting. But only at one time in the deliberations up until the very end did anybody say, what about a Bill of Rights? Why don't we have a Bill of Rights? We're just talking about the structure of government. We're going to have a stronger government. The Articles of Confederation had no executive branch. It had no judiciary branch. It just had a legislative branch. The genius of the Constitutional Convention was they had a executive branch led by the president. They had a judicial branch, and they had the legislative branch. And of course, you know, with the big fight on the legislative branch was on the representation when that ultimately was agreed to by having a House and a Senate with different ways of representation. The agreement came together ultimately. But only one member actually spoke up during the entire Constitutional Convention to the last couple of days, said maybe we should have a Bill of Rights. That was Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, and nobody paid attention. Then with about 3 or 4 days to go, when the Constitution was being wrapped up, George Mason from Virginia, who had written the Virginia Declaration of Rights earlier, and that was actually a document that Thomas Jefferson had used as a basis for some of what was in the Declaration of Independence. Mason said, well, how can we agree to this without a Bill of Rights? And at that point, they were tired, they were sweating, they couldn't wait to go home, and they just kind of shouted him down. And they just said it wasn't necessary. Madison got up and said, we don't need a Bill of Rights because the states really guarantee the rights, and many of the state constitutions have the protection of rights because the state constitutions have various rights prescribed there. And since the federal government isn't going to take away your rights, why do you need to have the protection from the federal government of that? Also, people wanted to go home, and they were afraid that if they opened up this debate, they wouldn't get out of there for a while. So it was shouted down, voted down, and with really not that much debate, the Constitutional Convention agreed to the Constitution, but no Bill of Rights. And then the effort to ratify began. And it turned out that many people were afraid of a new government with the strong powers that this new government would have without a Bill of Rights. Now, some people were completely against the new government, and they said, well, how can we kill this in the ratification process? Well, they said, maybe we'll use the argument that there's no Bill of Rights, scare everybody about how significant the government would be, how powerful, and without a Bill of Rights, the Constitution will really not really work. Some people actually believe there should be a Bill of Rights. They wanted the new government, but they believe there should be a Bill of Rights. As the ratification process went forward, it turned out that some states said, we will agree to the Constitution, but only if there are a Bill of Rights attached to it, or some Bill of Rights attached to it, or some version of it. And actually 9 of the 13 states, actually 9 states are ratified with some requirement that there be amendments to it, and a lot of those amendments would be what we would call the Bill of Rights. But none of the 9 actually required their ratification to be dependent on there actually being a Bill of Rights. So actually, when 9 of the 13 states agreed to the Constitution, it was ratified. Actually, only 11 initially agreed to it. North Carolina and Rhode Island did not initially agree to it, but 9 were all that was necessary. Okay, so in the ratification process, James Madison, who had been against the Bill of Rights, began to realize that a lot of people really wanted a Bill of Rights, and he was afraid that if their Bill of Rights was not ultimately agreed to, maybe there wouldn't be a Constitution that would work. And in fact, he was trying to argue in the Virginia ratification process that there should be no Bill of Rights, but he recognized how strong the effort was in Virginia to get a Bill of Rights. And so ultimately, he recognized that if the Constitution was going to work, it probably needed to have a Bill of Rights for two reasons. One, to please those who thought you needed a Bill of Rights to protect certain rights, and secondly, to make certain that those who really didn't want the new Constitution at all, who wanted to go back to the Articles of Confederation, would have no grounds to stand on, and that they would be beaten back because they were really trying to kill the entire Constitution. If it had a Bill of Rights, he thought maybe it would prevail and the Constitution would take off. So he wanted to run for Congress and be a member of Congress. The first Congress would agree to have a Bill of Rights. And in fact, he wanted to run for the Senate. The Senate, as you may know, in those days in the Constitution was appointed by the state legislators. The state legislature in Virginia was not happy with Madison. It was controlled then by Patrick Henry, the governor, and so he had no chance of being appointed to the Senate, so he ran for the House of Representatives, and he barely won. He got into the House of Representatives, and while he was campaigning to be elected to the House of Representatives, he committed that he would be in favor of a Bill of Rights. And in fact, when the Congress set up and was started really in March and April of that year, 1789, he began the effort to draft a Bill of Rights. He surveyed all the states that had ratified the Constitution, and he gathered that there were roughly 109 different proposals for amendments. He boiled them down to roughly about 42 different provisions. And he began to say in the House of Representatives, let's have a Bill of Rights. And he was kind of shouted down because people said, well, why do we need one? Those people who wanted the Constitution to take effect said, the Constitution's in effect already, we've already ratified it, let's let it work for a couple years before we figure out how we amend things. So a lot of the people who wanted the Constitution to succeed as Hamilton and as Madison didn't really want it. And many people, just were not interested in dealing with it. They said we have more important priorities. We have to get the judiciary set up. We have to figure out how to tax and impose taxation. So this was not significant. So Madison was shouted down a couple times, and no effort was really made to make the Bill of Rights go forward. Eventually, he persisted, and eventually he got the Congress to agree, the House of Representatives to agree to at least have a committee to study it. A committee of 11 people. They came back, look what he did, and ultimately they came back to the House of Representatives and said, okay, we have taken all the provisions that Madison has come up with, and we boiled them down to more or less 17 different provisions and 17 different, you could say, amendments. Madison had the view that you shouldn't actually have amendments in the way we now see them attached to the document at the end. You should take these amendments, in his case 42, ultimately down to 17, and put them inserted into the document. So when you read the document, it would have all the amendments really in there, and you wouldn't be able to tell what was the original part and what was the subsequent part. That was not agreed to. Roger Sherman of Connecticut was against that. So ultimately, the House of Representatives agreed to have amendments attached to the Constitution, and 17 of them. They then sent it to the Senate. The Senate didn't spend that much time on it. They made some changes and ultimately took the 17 down to 12. And they sent it back to the House for agreement. Ultimately, a committee agreed to it, and they had 12 amendments. So that there were 12, and the First Amendment was not what we now regard as the First Amendment. The First Amendment was a provision that basically expanded the number of representatives in the Congress. It was Madison's view and others that there should be more representation. Every state should have at least 2 members of House of Representatives. The Second Amendment originally was an amendment that said no member of Congress can benefit from having voted to increase his salary. So if you are in Congress, you can't say we should have a higher salary, and that would be against the amendment that Madison had favored. That one was the second. And the Third Amendment was what we now call the First Amendment. So the 12 amendments were agreed to by the Congress. The head of the Senate in those days was the head of the House, the Speaker of the House was Fred Muhlenberg, not a Jewish Fred Muhlenberg. And the head of the Senate was John Adams. They signed the documents, and they had the engrossed copy of the Bill of Rights, the 12 amendments. And they then had, in effect, another, I think, 13 engrossed copies put together, one to be sent to each of the states. George Washington, in effect, sent a letter to all the states saying, here are the 12 amendments, and you should ratify them. The ratification process was complicated. It went along the same ways that the ratification of the Constitution. Not everybody was in favor of it. Some people thought we didn't need the Bill of Rights. And ultimately, the states agreed to 10 of the 12. They didn't agree to the first 2. The first one was not agreed to because many people didn't think we needed a bigger government, and they didn't want a bigger government, and the First Amendment would have had larger members of the House, more members of the House of Representatives, and a bigger government. The second one was not agreed to, not because it was thought that it was a bad idea that members of Congress should not get a salary increase that they vote for it until the next Congress, but they thought that members of Congress should never have a salary increase. So why agree to it at all? So that wasn't agreed to. As you now know, many, many years later, not too long ago, it was ultimately agreed to. It was then called Madison's Amendment, and we did agree to it a few years ago. It's now the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. But at that time, they didn't think any member of Congress should ever get a higher salary, so they didn't want to agree to that. And ultimately, the Congress agreed to the states agreed to these amendments. Interestingly, though, when they were agreed to, they were not all that significant. It was not said, okay, now that we have the Bill of Rights, we have all these great protections. They were largely ignored. It was an adornment to the Constitution. And in fact, there was no litigation over the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and so forth, in large part because it wasn't thought that these Bill of Rights really did anything more than just adorn the Constitution. And so there was no litigation protecting interpreting the Bill of Rights or interpreting the First Amendment for many, many years. And not until really the 1930s did the First Amendment get dealt with by the Supreme Court. So the Bill of Rights, now we view it as a sacred document, but early in our history, it really wasn't viewed as that significant a document in many ways. It was nice to have, and Madison thought it honored his obligation to get a Bill of Rights, but what he really was doing is protecting his Constitution. Madison's real view was that Bill of Rights aren't necessary because you don't really need a Bill of Rights to protect citizens from their own government. Maybe you need a Bill of Rights to protect it from a monarch, a king, but since the government is really the people wouldn't do anything that would destroy the rights of people, and it wasn't necessary. But he ultimately agreed to pursue it, in part because he thought it would ensure that the government that he had created, the constitutional government under the Constitutional Convention, would survive if it had the Bill of Rights. And in fact, obviously the government survived. The Bill of Rights, as we now know, is a very rare document, the original document, the original document that was agreed to by the Congress, and that was sent, copies of which were sent out to the 13 states. That original document is still now in the archives of the United States. It's interesting. When that document was kept, it was kept with the Declaration of Independence and was ultimately owned in effect by the State Department. Now, we didn't have an archives originally in our country, and so each department the government kept its own documents that didn't really work, and a lot of them were lost as a result. But the key documents, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights were held by the State Department. And when we were invaded by the British in the War of 1812, somebody put all these documents together, folded them up, put them in a bag, and hid them in Leesburg, Virginia, in a cave. But ultimately, these documents were treated not that well. They were displayed in public for a long time. They were faded a bit. And if you go to see the original of the Bill of Rights now in the archives, it's very much faded. There are other copies of this document because, as I said, one was sent to every state, and today there are about 12 extant copies. The Constitution Center has one of those here, which you can see. It's in the George Herbert Walker Bush Gallery. It's really on a loan, in effect, from the New York Public Library, but it's not quite clear how the New York Public Library got one of these copies. It probably was the original copy that was sent to Pennsylvania, and maybe it was stolen from Pennsylvania at some point. And the New York Public Library has it, and so an agreement has been reached that Jeff Rosen was very clever in getting done, which is to basically say that it will be shared between the New York Public Library and the Constitution Center from time to time, and right now it happens to be here, and so I highly recommend you have a chance to look at it. My main point in conclusion is that while we today talk about how important the Bill of Rights is, and it is, and how important the First Amendment is, and it is, in the early days of our country, the Bill of Rights were not all that significant. Many people didn't think that they were necessary. Many people opposed having them, thinking that the states really had the power, not the federal government. And the First Amendment originally wasn't the First Amendment, it was the Third Amendment. Why was it the Third Amendment? There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It was just the way that it was put together by Madison in his original drafting. It could have been the Fifth Amendment or so forth, but it was originally one of the most important rights that he thought was important, but it wasn't a right actually that was as important to many of the founding fathers as the other things that are in the Bill of Rights. But nonetheless, it has the title First Amendment, and it is no doubt today one of the most important things that our Constitution contains. So let me end there and say thank you very much for that, Jeff. No. I think I've eaten up my time. I eat up all my time, so I don't know if there's any questions we have time for. But
If you don't mind, just a few questions,
All right.
just to sum up, because that was superb. And it was so interesting to learn the reasons that those original first two amendments were rejected because of a fear of too large a federal government. Does the fact that the original First Amendment dealt with questions of apportionment suggest the framers are more concerned about questions of representation in government than about free speech?
Well, I absolutely. I think some of the members of the Congress thought that, and certainly Madison, that we wanted to have more people in the legislature, not as few as they had. And so he wanted to make sure that there were at least two in every state. As we now know, we only have one in some states because of the population. So yes, it would have been a bigger Congress and maybe better and maybe not.
Now, you remind us that Madison thinks you don't need a Bill of Rights because the people won't pass stuff that infringe rights. And yet the first Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the Republican vice president, rather the Federalist president, Adams, not the Republican vice president. And Madison criticizes this in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. What's the real protection for liberty for most of American history until the 30s? Was it the people? Was it the courts? Was it the amendments?
Well, the Alien Sedition Act was something that you would say would be a violation of the First Amendment. But interestingly, there was no litigation. It never went to court, really, and the Supreme Court never dealt with it. And in fact, ultimately, those people who were put in jail or otherwise penalized by violating the sedition part of that were all pardoned by Jefferson, ultimately. I think that the Alien Sedition Act was put in by Adams and the Federalists, and of course Madison was against that. But I think ultimately the courts were not viewed as the protectors of rights the way that we do view them today. The courts were kind of an adjunct, but remember Marbury Madison didn't come around to 1803, and is that right, 1803? That's right, yes. 1803. So the concept that the Bill of Rights or something could be done that was in violation of the Constitution wasn't a prevalent concept.
And yet almost all of the states have versions of the First Amendment, as you can learn on the riveting interactive Constitution. And they declare it to be a natural right that comes from God and not government, and yet they didn't really enforce it in ways that we understand it today.
Well, remember, each of the states had their own constitutions, and many of them had these Bill of Rights. And so many of the members of the Congress and other citizens thought that their protections were coming from the states and not from the federal government. The federal government, as they saw it, was really a construct of getting a legislative branch and a judicial branch and executive branch, but worrying about rights, that was really something that the states really protected them on, and so they didn't really think the federal government needed it.
We talked a lot earlier today about Louis Brandeis's vision of the First Amendment, which defines us today. You can only ban speech when it threatens imminent violence. Madison and Jefferson embraced a version of that in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, but as you said, it took until the 30s or later, to the 60s really, for the Supreme Court to embrace it. Why did it take so long? And basically, why are bills of rights important if their meaning can evolve so dramatically over time?
Well, of course, Madison, interesting, did an incredible flip-flop. He first was against it before he was for it. And he was against the Bill of Rights initially because he really wanted to get the Constitutional Convention finished. He also thought that these were parchment kind of protections. They weren't really any meaningful because you didn't really need protections against the people. You need them against the king. So he didn't really think they were necessary. And to the extent they were necessary, they were already in the state constitutions anyway. So he was not a big fan of it, really. And ultimately, he changed his position in order to make certain that the Constitution would stay in effect. In the early days, there was a big concern that some people who were against the Constitution, then called the anti-federalists, would try to ultimately overturn the government in some way or make sure it didn't work. And so he was trying to make sure that his handicraft would stay together, and he thought the Bill of Rights would be a way to protect it.
So Madison thought you could just constrain federal power and then there'd be no power to infringe rights. The anti-federalists say better safe than sorry. Were they ultimately proved right?
Well, I think today, I think if we didn't have a Bill of Rights, I think the Constitution would be considered much less effective a document. And I think today, when constitutions are drafted around the world, they all have bills of rights in them because they want to be not unlike ours. My point earlier today was really saying, while we value the Bill of Rights and value the First Amendment, it is very interesting that we didn't really value them that much early on. And they weren't that significant in part because until the 14th Amendment occurred, and the states, in effect, had the federal government or the Bill of Rights and Constitution incorporated, judges didn't really think that anything that was protecting somebody from the federal government was really applicable in the state governments. Madison actually had the view that when he wanted to have the Bill of Rights, when he, in his earlier draft, he wanted it to say that the federal government rights would apply to the states. He wanted that, and that was kicked out because the other people didn't really want to do that, and so he dropped that. And it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that and later the incorporation of the 14th Amendment into the Bill of Rights that protection really applied throughout all the states.
Absolutely right. I know I keep plugging this, but it's because it's so exciting. So the Interactive Constitution shows the 4 amendments Madison proposed but weren't adopted, and one is the one that David correctly says Madison thought was the most important in the bunch that would have prohibited the states as well as the feds from violating liberty, and as he said, it took the 14th Amendment to actually pass that. Okay, just a few more beats, and then we're going to let people have drinks and celebrate freedom convivially over refreshment.
Freedom of drink.
Freedom of drink is very important, although it was denied by the Prohibition Amendment, which was thankfully repealed. Right. We've just had this incredible day discussing, celebrating, debating the meaning of the First Amendment and freedom. From your perspective, what has protected free speech throughout American history? Courts, the people, culture, judges, what's it been?
Well, of course, one of Madison's view was that ultimately the Bill of Rights would become part of our culture. And if it became part of our culture, ultimately the people would feel that they were protecting the free speech and other rights in the Bill of Rights. But I'd say the courts have probably been the bulwark and the greatest protectors of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, because they've consistently, made tough decisions against things that were maybe popular at the time. But I think ultimately our culture has moved in a direction of thinking that the right to free speech is a right that's inherent. And therefore, I think it's true that what Madison thought would happen did happen. Ultimately, part of our culture ultimately accepted the Bill of Rights as part of our living and breathing Constitution, part of our DNA.
And you've devoted your life to educating Americans about these liberties. I'm going to ask a really basic but important question. Why is free speech important?
Well, if you look at governments that don't have free speech, they tend to take away other rights of people as well. And they also tend to not let people live up to their full potential. So, humans came out of caves around 200,000 years ago. Homo sapiens are roughly 200,000 years old. And when you think about it, when we came out of caves 200,000 years ago, it probably wasn't apparent to all the other species on the face of the earth that we would dominate the face of the earth. And it probably isn't apparent to many of us that we will actually be around another 200,000 years. But the reason we have dominated Earth is because of our brain. The human brain is the greatest, thing that's, I think, on the face of the earth. We have a brain that animals don't have, and we have the ability to express ourselves in a way that animals cannot. We have the ability to interact with others in a way that animals cannot, and we have the ability to use this brain to come up with extraordinary kinds of things, from Picasso to Shakespeare to Madison to the Constitution. And when you think about what the human brain has accomplished, it just makes you in awe of our Creator, who came up with this incredible device that we all have. And I think in all societies, when you are able to use that brain and you can express your views, you ultimately have a much better society. So societies are totalitarian and don't let us express or let people express themselves, I think, are much less rich societies, and human existence is much less valuable and enjoyable.
I can't top that.
Okay. All right.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Great. That was magnificent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining for an incredible Freedom Day. And the most exciting thing about this is it's going to continue, and it's going to happen next year and the year after that. And we are going to bring this great message of freedom and of nonpartisan constitutional education across America and across the globe. We're going to be played out by the beautiful strains of Elton John and Philadelphia Freedom. So please join us for drinks. Many thanks. It's really good. Nice, huh? Yeah.